When we look at trying to classify things, we obviously have a very terrestrial perspective because we're a terrestrial animal. But 70% of the planet is covered in water, and there's a lot of species found in there. So there's like 250,000 species known to live in the marine environment, and more are likely to be discovered. So we're still discovering new ecosystems and new species. Um, when life evolved in water, it has the physical and chemical properties to be a really easy place to live. It's got a stable temperature. You have buoyancy, so you're able to keep your place in the water column. And what we find the selective forces in aquatic systems to be very different than what we find in terrestrial systems. So they operate very differently. Aquatic biomes are classified based on their physical characteristics, as opposed to the terrestrial ones being classified based on their dominant plants. The aquatic ones are based on the abiotic environment, things like salinity and water movement, salt water versus fresh water, lentic or lotic. So some of the water systems or aquatic systems we're probably more familiar with being terrestrial animals is looking at the lakes and ponds, which are in fresh waters. And there, when you go deep in the water, you find significant differences in community structure as you get down into from the photic zone where you have lots of light down into the darker water. So a lot of phytoplankton, little floating algae and floating little tiny animals, the zooplankton are found up in that light zone. And then when you get down into the aphotic zone, the dark zone, you're going to find the dead things will fall, the detritus is down there, and the decomposers. There are also moving freshwaters, which we find the streams and rivers. So we find that there's a zonation from being upstream with these small streams down to these broad, wide, relatively flat rivers that move much more slowly as you get downstream. And we find that the physical characteristics and the chemical characteristics change, which means you have different organisms living in those two different types of moving fresh waters. It changes the algae, it changes what's living on the bottom, it changes what fish you have. And then there's marine systems. 3/4 of the world's surface is covered in salt water, has an impact on climate, on wind patterns, and the algae floating in that water, the single-celled plants, the algae, are supplying most of the world's oxygen. When we look in marine systems, then we can see there's obviously going to be differences depending on whether you're close to the continents on the continental shelf or whether you're down in the slope where it falls off rapidly, whether you're in a subduction zone where the plates are colliding, or a deep sea trench where the plates are spreading apart, where you've got lots of volcanic activity. Obviously, it's different if you're up here where you've got lots of light coming in versus down here where it's dark. So there's a lot of different physical characteristics when you're in a marine system. So when we go from the top of the surface of the water down into the deep water, you've got vertical changes, but then when you're going from the coast where you've got the tides coming in and out down to the oceanic zones, you've got horizontal changes in the system. So the intertidal area where it gets dried out between the tides. Then we've got the shallow areas, the neritic areas, which are on the continental shelves. And then when you go out in the oceanic areas where you've got the deeper zones. When you've got open water communities, that's the pelagic community. But then you've got things living on the bottom. And any aquatic system, marine system, where you have things living on the bottom, that the sea floor, the lake floor, that's the benthic community. When we get down deep in the ocean, you've got cold water, very high pressure, and no light, and yet we still find organisms living. So we look at these deep sea fishes with their little lures that will fluoresce so that it'll attract something to eat. One important ecosystem that is on the boundary between terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems are estuaries. This is where the freshwater rivers pour into the oceans, but the tidal movement of salt water back up into the estuaries bring nutrients there. So you're washing nutrients off the land into the rivers, into the ocean, very high numbers of nutrients. So these estuaries tend to be some of the most productive in the world. They're not very diverse. There's not a lot of species tolerant of the salinity of the salt water coming in, but they do grow very well. And then because of the growth of the algae and the plants, you get lots of animals living there, oysters, crabs, fish, and then the birds will come in and feed on those. And these are areas that are really in danger from water pollution from us polluting the fresh water on the land.